And now I have a pleasure to introduce to you my colleague and friend, Dr. Nerijus Sepetys, a historian working in the Vilnius University, as well as the chief editor of magazine Naujasis zidinys, and an outstanding commentator. Could you please share your thoughts on the topic? Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. We are in an awkward situation in Seimas, a strange situation when one term of office ended yesterday and the new one hasn't yet started. So I sometimes feel that I might lack the insights on certain topics, and the questions raised in the end of the last session partly answered my insights. And I would like to focus now on two main aspects. The first will be difference from the European viewpoint, whether the European memory politics, common politics, is possible at all. But in view of the European context, I will try to look into it. Probably I will not say anything new, but probably it's worthwhile repeating some things. And on the other hand, I would like to share a few discoveries from a specific research of the historical conscience that we have conducted together with the Vilnius University students. I would like to start from a distance. Difference between common European space, historical experience, sharing that experience, traditions, and something which is called Baltic. Alain Besançon, French philosopher, has issued a book, and it's a quote from that book, almost 15 years ago, about the disproportion of memory, National Socialism and Communism. There are objective circumstances that are easy to explain as to why the memory is as such. Besançon has his own explanation to this, but what is most important here is not the difference, but probably the different directions the individual memories moving towards. When coming across one or another phenomenon, we can attribute to National Socialism or Communism, leaving the remark that the communism is systemized, whatever. But this contrast is interesting, and how we could check this philosophical statement. Let's say if we make a survey or some other research. Just one example of the research that has been carried out. The data are quite characteristic. I selected them from research carried out in 4 countries, and respondents were young people who had no or almost no experience from the period of the Cold War, and who are in honest start positions. The goal of this research was to clarify not what people think and how they see the symbolic structures like Auschwitz and Gulag, but rather to find out where are the limits of knowing and imagining. And it turned out that these limits do exist, and this is influenced not only by the school or the space where people live, often that comes from experience. Communism is, what communist regimes are, as well as communist crimes are, is approaching the boundary of myth, which is quite dangerous. Because when we speak about communism, differently from speaking about National Socialism, in many cases is not the issue of the past, but also the issue of today and of the politics. We can come across it in various European Union member states as well. Because communist ideology has been alive in all the layers, in most layers of society. It's deep-rooted indeed. I have nothing against Sweden, but I found this example quite interesting. And we can come to Vytautas Bruveris' question at the end of our first session, recalling that our specific features may be a presupposition. How is our historical experience special? One thing, when we speak about the years of the Second World War and when it's just a matter of Baltic nations, National Socialism and Communism were first of all conceived as the contradictory forces, contradictory regimes, no matter what they really represented at the time. 50 years ago, when the Soviet Union collapsed, National Socialism and Communism came back to our conscience again, and this was how we learned about our history. And that experience, let's say, of our national movement, Sąjūdis, let's say, is also history today. If we look at the war experience, there are not many people left still alive who can share the experience. And a few decades ago, they were scared to speak about that experience in fear of persecution. And now it's quite popular to speak about Stalin and Hitler together. And this is why some school pupils start to mix these leaders nowadays. This is a matter of education and the matter of the forming identity. I've been looking for examples, and I decided to stick to the one I found long ago, which seems quite suitable to me. Just a media survey which showed that people find it easiest to identify these two things together, not comparing them. Even though it might seem that people tend to compare them at all times, especially in public spaces. But I'm not speaking about initiatives of groups of people. I mean just ordinary residents of our country. Those who don't reflect upon these things, but who do have their opinions on this issue. So their perception of inhumanness of National Socialism and communism is quite similar. We can repeatedly make these surveys, expand the list of questions. However, the result would be the same, which is that about 50% of people don't really differentiate between the two. And this illustrates the refusal to compare these regimes. I have tried to give similar lectures in a few universities in Germany after the surveys. The problem seemed quite difficult to understand to those people because they have a double experience and proportions are quite different. So this is a problem. Probably you will agree with me, and you can solve it in different ways. Probably I will not speak about these ways today. Just mention the possibilities and what usually happens. Well, the most painful possibility arises when we have a misunderstanding and failure to communicate. It doesn't often occur. However, when it occurs, we hear about them through various media tools, and one of such conflicts mentioned about 8 or 9 years ago when Leipzig Book Fair was being opened. When a politician spoke during the opening and who mentioned the concept of genocide not quite adequately, and Solomon Kohn, the vice president of the Jewish community, if I remember right, left the hall and subsequently gave an interview to journalists and sounded quite indignant. However, this conceptual misunderstanding that occurred at that time, the conflict, was important because both these people represented victims, and it is usually very hard for one victim to be fully heard, especially when each of them have their own wounds and experiences, and when victim starts to speak, sometimes we tend to think that he or she speaks on the account of others, at the expense of others. And when two individual experiences collide, the conflict is inevitable, and most probably it's not a negative phenomenon because it helps to purify certain concepts. And I believe that the concept genocide has moved towards the marginal point. For instance, when we are saying that psycho-genocide is applied against people, it's not really good. We have other concepts, crimes against humanity, which sounds quite natural today. We have the way of agreeing, accord. A few years ago, we had a meeting of Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It was stressed that Holocaust was a unique phenomenon and emphasized the problems that Eastern European countries face when on their way to democracy, on their shift to democracy. However, it often happens that different experiences are ignored or another way is chosen when, let's say, one model of education is chosen. We see it in Germany, for example. Historical education is very hard to separate from historical experience in any countries and difficult to move from one space to another. Although we can learn and find ways to perceive it as best as we can. There is another way as well, which is to recognize the differences, recalling that our historical difference is special and it has to be taken into consideration, which is not so difficult to implement these days. Now I would like to shift to my second part and speak about the historical memory situation. Well, before I present my research, I would like to say that when speaking about the so-called Balts, we tend to say that they consider their history especially important, and they like to emphasize their exceptional history in every possible way. Without denying this, I would like to express certain doubts regarding the scope of this phenomenon. When I thought what cultures we have to develop, I decided to look into the research that has been conducted before by Mr. Sepetys and others, based on presupposition that all Lithuanian people have some historical conscience. However, this presupposition seems quite doubtful to me, for the reason that people who faced a similar psychological survey, I don't know how many of you have been participating in answering questions like this. However, what answer would you give to the question as to how you view one historical phenomenon, a historical actor, whatever? So, in my understanding, quantitative research is important when you know the level of conscience. Well, we have a TV program, Klausimėlis, a little question on our television, which tells us a lot about our people's conscience. It shows that people have a clear opinion and a scale of values However, sometimes they misinterpret the content quite significantly. So the evaluation of some historical events or personalities made me to think about the depth of that historical conscience. I was combining open and closed questions. We have surveyed about 1,000 people. Those were the people not connected to history. The questionnaires had to be filled in manually without using the internet or other knowledge sources. And the questions were oriented, first of all, regarding self-understanding, how they view the Lithuanian history, and the third category, the most important historical actors, famous dates, most attractive places, symbols of Lithuanianhood, and so on. Not all the people answered all the questions. Sometimes certain questions remained unanswered, and this also has to be evaluated and taken into account. But when you ask a person about what is most shameful according to you in the history of Lithuania, usually you create a situation which differs from that during the examinations at school. I surveyed the respondents, asking them whether it was really difficult to answer the questions. And about half of them answered that it was extremely difficult because there were no answers given, no alternative answers given. And the questions themselves sounded quite different from the examinations at school. I believe that in this case, the trustworthiness of the answers that we received was much higher. Well, the general conclusion is that in historical conscience, you don't find much historical conscience in people. Some people do have historic knowledge of history from school or elsewhere, and they would like to refer to the internet or other knowledge sources in order to find answers to these questions. Well, most people know the main, most famous facts from the Lithuanian history, for instance, the Grand Duke Vytautas, but then there is silence until the years of reestablishment of the Republic of Lithuania. Well, some people, of course, know our President Smetona's name, but not much more than that. It's not an active knowledge that they have. Now, speaking about specific questions, I have a few examples here, and one of them is about the shameful situation. It turned out that the first thing when the event is complicated, people tend to divide it into several parts, and let's say they mention the year 1940, and here they tend to separate three things: the shameful situation itself, the shameful behavior, the shameful failure to act. And the fact that 307 out of 1,000 have answered this question is quite a good thing. As for the question, what is the most honorable in Lithuania's history, was the question answered by almost half of the respondents. Collaboration with Nazis was mentioned more frequently than collaboration with Soviets. But in general, this interconnection of various events and factors makes it difficult to understand what they actually mean. For instance, they mix 1940 and 1941. Well, the survey shows that the historical conscience does exist. And this is political conscience because people see them as a part of politics. And alongside, in some questionnaires, people tend to mix historical events with recent or current political aspects. For instance, some respondents mentioned the impeachment of our former president, Rolandas Paksas, and it's not fully understandable whether people view it as a positive or negative phenomenon. It's a complex that you have certain opinion about, and here we deal with the mythic conscience. As for fully historical events up to 1940, many people seem to have very little knowledge about. Many people have Šapoka's Lithuanian history book, which was extremely popular at the time it appeared in our bookstores. However, I don't believe that many people have read this book. But in general, we have noticed that Soviet or Nazi experience is something that many people mention when answering the questions. I'm not going to comment this table in detail. The 13th of January 1991 was the answer given by people from various residential places, rural areas, towns and cities. But let's say the events of the 13th of January seem to be the events that people have really memorized, and they also indicated as a connected with the losses. National Socialism and the losses due to it are not frequently reflected. There was a very complicated question in the research. As to who harmed us mostly. And the question, who has the right to treat us as the one who has made harm to them? Less than 1/3 of people seemed to understand this question. 29 to 30% perceived what we asked about, and most of people who responded to this question indicated the extermination of Jews in Lithuania. It shows that this motive is reflected in people's historical memory. It also indicates that the Jewish community was not considered our part. Because when you ask people who people treat you as such, and when you ask them to list 5 things you can describe yourself, so Lithuanianhood was the answer given by, let's say, 25 to 30% of people, because first comes the person's name, surname, family, and so on and so forth, whereas nationality seems to be much less important. And I'm not going to comment upon the table. Heroes and scoundrels seem to be things that our people seem to be most interested about. And 330 people answered the question about the scoundrels. And namely, in this question, the situation changed in 2011. Probably we should have surveyed more than 1,000 people, but nevertheless, we have quite interesting answers here. For instance, Tadas Blinda from the famous Lithuanian film, almost a mythical figure, mythical hero. People know these names, but they are hardly familiar with the specific content of their activities. Professor Vytautas Landsbergis has the 4th place in the table, ranges the 4th, and it's really interesting to see people's historical memory with some mythical elements. And in many cases, people seem to be lacking the content of this memory. What morale does all this have? Well, in case we have some state policy, policy of history, all kinds of support, memorialization. The education at schools would not create any historical structures. Probably we have to take into account the situation of the historical memory prevailing in our people's mind and conscience, and then take decisions as to what needs to be done to change the situation. Another point we can make here, speaking about totalitarian regimes, is to think about them in complex let's say, taking James Bond cocktail recipes. I understand that we can't do anything much about them. Look into similarities and differences and criminalize or give moral evaluation to everyone, to each of them. And not separate them in historical sense. Well, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Dėkui, Nerijui, už tokį tikrai.
Thank you for your presentation, which draws the correct picture of our historical conscience. I hope there will be some reactions, because Nerijus is leaving after the presentation, so if you have any questions, please put them forward. The table about the young people in Sweden, I'm interested in that. I represent the Ecology University of Vilnius. He talked about the young people in Sweden who know a lot about Holocaust and know nothing about the Gulag. Have you ever seen the programs, the content of programs in Sweden for students at school? I have heard that these issues are not covered for many people abroad. Somebody told me that while living in the US, he never heard about Russia at all at school. So can this be associated with a school curriculum? I am an anarchist in terms of education. I don't believe people follow educationalists. If a teacher is a good one, then the person will learn, and if a teacher is a lousy one, he will not learn much. I asked somebody I know in Sweden, is it true that people don't learn anything about the Soviet Union in Sweden? He said that's not true, but nobody can check, and nobody wishes to check that. Of course, maybe the curriculum includes less information on the USSR in Sweden, but this is not a problem that you could address that way. I don't believe in historical education as such. It grows from experience, and it's oriented to the people who have something already in place. Our study demonstrated that school wasn't of key importance for people when they formed their historical memory, even if they say so, even if they say it did. When a teacher is intelligent, he will be not working at a school in the first place. Let me give the floor, because whenever I hear anything about the school, I feel obliged to talk about it. I am a history teacher, Jūratė Litinaitė. Who should shape the historical consciousness if not schools? Do we need a historical consciousness at all? We're saying that historical consciousness is not necessary to people because it doesn't give anything to a personality. You said that schools are incapable of shaping the historical memory, and this is the task of every person who has. It is up to a teacher to whether shape this consciousness in children or not. So do we agree that it's necessary to do that? And if we agree on that, who should do this and how? Should we protect this decision from the personal choice of the teacher? If the curriculum is just a paper to you. Well, that's not a paper, that's just a guideline for somebody who don't know what to do. And let's say I do know how to do it, but this doesn't agree with the general idea and interest of the state and society. If teacher is the first person to decide how to shape historical consciousness, this is not a responsible decision. Why do you leave the teacher this right? Because you know that nobody checks how teachers work. I can be successful in telling children that Jews cooperated with the Soviets, and nobody will say anything. Nobody checks. But there is a program, there are guidelines. It includes the shaping of the general historical conscience, and this is the requirement for the teacher to be a responsible teacher. Do you have any other suggestions? As far as the content is concerned, I will not argue with you. You mentioned control, for instance. Nobody checks, you said. I would say, thanks God, you said, unfortunately. When we speak about personal responsibility, historical conscience isn't something you can shape. It's not a thing. There are certain mechanisms and structures that are at work. If you remember your studies at the university, I remember once I became aware of having an image of history. For some people, teachers, for others, family experience or books are of key importance in shaping the historical conscience. But I think that books, historical, authentic experience, and media that create an important impression for you are of key importance. We may say that it's the role of teachers, books, or families, but a person is not a tabula rasa. There are many things we can't control and don't even know the mechanisms that they work with. If we knew this, we would be creating a new human being. We know that the Soviets and Nazis wanted to create a new human being, but they failed. Of course, some parts of conscience have been lost, and I hope that these losses will be recovered. Patriotism is important. Guidelines are necessary. Seminars are necessary. When teachers go abroad, if they come back with many experiences and they seem better. But I don't believe in the rationalist educational method. I think it is similar to the Bolshevik educational method. This is why I don't want to create a system here. There's too much of a system there in place anyway. So you think the historical memory and conscience should be shaped in its own way and nobody should interfere? No, we wouldn't be able to prohibit anyone from shaping the historical conscience, but what the school is doing is providing people with knowledge. The more knowledge a person has, the less reflection he has, Nietzsche said. Memorization of information is of key importance so far, but I think this is the wrong direction to take, and we could do other things to shape historical conscience. I know many good history teachers whom I met after I graduated school. They're great people, and I realized they know those things well enough. People should shape their historical conscience themselves. Don't create a state system that works at that. We had such a system before. This is a very interesting discussion indeed, but I'm compelled to interfere and to give the floor to Professor Nerijus